The blood on her hands was still warm when Isaac Walker first saw her kneeling in the dirt, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to tear through her entire body. He had been riding down from his mountain camp with 3 pelts strapped to his pack horse, intending to trade them at the general store in Breckenridge, Colorado, when he spotted the young woman beside the road. The year was 1878, and the late spring sun beat down mercilessly on the high mountain valley, but Isaac felt a chill run through him at the sight of her grief. He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. The woman didn't seem to notice him approaching, her attention fixed on the large brown and white cow lying motionless in the grass beside her small homestead. Isaac was a big man, standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle from years of trapping, hunting, and surviving alone in the rugged Colorado mountains. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his weathered face. He moved quietly despite his size, a habit formed from years of stalking game through the wilderness. "Madam," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She jerked her head up, and Isaac found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he had ever seen. They were red-rimmed and swimming with tears, and her face was streaked with dirt and grief. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with honey-colored hair that had come loose from its pins and tumbled around her shoulders. Even in her distress, there was something about her that made Isaac's breath catch in his throat. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't hear you coming." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, leaving another smudge of dirt across her cheek. "Please, just go on your way. I'm fine." But she clearly wasn't fine. Isaac could see that much. He glanced at the cow again, taking in the swollen belly and the blood pooled beneath the animal. "Looks like she was trying to calve," he observed quietly. The woman's face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "She got stuck. I tried to help her. I tried everything I could think of, but I couldn't save her. I couldn't save either of them." Her voice rose with each word until she was nearly shouting. "And now I'm going to lose everything." Isaac crouched down beside her, his knees creaking slightly. Up close, he could see how thin she was, how worn her dress looked. This wasn't just about losing a cow, he realized. This was about survival. In this harsh land, a single cow could mean the difference between making it through the winter and starving. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She took a shaky breath, clearly trying to compose herself. Julia Preston." "I'm Isaac Walker. I live up in the mountains about 5 miles north of here." He gestured vaguely toward the towering peaks that ringed the valley. "How long have you been out here on your own?" Julia's eyes widened slightly. "How did you know I was alone?" "No man would let his wife or daughter struggle with a birthing gone wrong without helping, and there's no sign of anyone else living here." He nodded toward the small, neat cabin behind them. It was well maintained, but clearly built for one person, maybe 2 at most. She looked away, fresh tears threatening to spill over. "My father died last winter, pneumonia. It was just supposed to be the 2 of us out here, building a new life after my mother passed back in Pennsylvania. He homesteaded this land 3 years ago, and we were doing all right. We had the cow, some chickens, a good garden plot. But then he got sick, and I couldn't save him either." Her voice broke on the last word. Isaac felt something twist in his chest. He knew what it was like to be alone, to fight for survival in this unforgiving land. He had been living in these mountains for nearly 8 years now, ever since he left the crowded streets of Denver behind. But he had chosen this life. Julia Preston hadn't had a choice. "This was your only cow," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded miserably. "I sold the calf last fall to buy supplies for winter. I thought Bessie would calve again this spring, and I could sell the new calf too, have enough money to get through another year, maybe even enough to buy some lumber and expand the cabin, take in boarders when the miners pass through." She laughed bitterly. "Stupid dreams." "They're not stupid," Isaac said firmly, "and you're not going to lose everything." Julia looked at him skeptically, wiping her eyes again. "I appreciate the kindness, Mr. Walker, but I don't see how I'm going to manage without Bessie. I needed that calf money. I needed the milk. Without them," she trailed off, staring at her dead cow. Isaac stood up, his mind already working through the problem. He had always been good at solving problems, at figuring out how to survive when the odds were stacked against him. And right now, He found himself wanting very much to help this young woman with the sad green eyes and the stubborn tilt to her chin. "I'm going to help you bury your cow," he said. "Then I'm going to ride into town and see what I can do about getting you a replacement." Julia scrambled to her feet, shaking her head. "No, I can't accept charity. I won't be a burden on anyone." "It's not charity," Isaac said, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. All he knew was that he couldn't ride away and leave her like this. "Consider it neighborly assistance. We mountain folk look out for each other." "I don't have money to pay you back," she said, her voice small. "I didn't ask for payment." Isaac held her gaze steadily. "Let me help you, Miss Preston, please." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly. "All right. Thank you." They spent the next 2 hours digging a hole big enough for the cow, working mostly in silence. Isaac did the bulk of the heavy labor, his powerful muscles making quick work of the hard mountain soil, but Julia insisted on helping. He could see the determination in every line of her body, the refusal to give up even in the face of this disaster. It stirred something in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. When the cow was finally buried, and they had both said a few words over the grave, Isaac washed his hands in the water trough and prepared to mount his horse again. Julia stood watching him, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon sun. "I'll be back," he told her. "Might take a few days, but I'll find you a cow." "Mr. Walker," she said, and he turned to look at her. "Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me." Isaac considered the question for a long moment. He could see the wariness in her eyes, the fear that there might be strings attached to his offer. He couldn't blame her. A woman alone in the wilderness had every reason to be cautious around strange men. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I've been alone in these mountains for a long time, Miss Preston. I've forgotten what it's like to be part of a community, to help neighbors and accept help in return. Maybe I need this as much as you do." She studied his face, and he let her look, standing still under her scrutiny. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded. "Thank you," she said again, and this time there was warmth in her voice. "And please, call me Julia." "Julia," he repeated, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. "I'll see you soon." He rode away from her small homestead as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, but he found himself looking back more than once. Each time he could see her standing in front of her cabin, watching him go, a small figure against the vast backdrop of mountains and sky. Isaac made camp that night in a grove of aspens about halfway to Breckenridge, but he barely slept. His mind kept returning to Julia Preston and her tear-stained face, to the way she had tried so hard to hold herself together, even as her world fell apart. He thought about the determination in her voice when she talked about her plans, about taking in boarders and building a life for herself out here in the wilderness. She had grit, that was certain, but grit alone wouldn't be enough to survive without that cow. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Isaac had formulated a plan. He broke camp quickly and rode hard for Breckenridge, pushing his horse faster than he normally would. The town was bustling when he arrived, full of miners and prospectors hoping to strike it rich in the mountains, as well as the merchants and traders who made their living off those dreams. Isaac's first stop was the general store, where he sold his pelts to the proprietor, a shrewd businessman named Henderson who knew quality furs when he saw them. The money Isaac received was decent, but not nearly enough to buy a good milk cow. He would need to get creative. He spent the rest of that day and all of the next asking around town, talking to ranchers and farmers, trying to find someone who might be willing to sell or trade a cow. The problem was that good dairy cows were valuable, and nobody wanted to part with one cheap. Isaac began to wonder if he had made a promise he couldn't keep. On the third day, his luck changed. He was sitting in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and trying to figure out his next move, when he overheard two men talking at the next table. One of them was complaining about a cow that had gone dry, no longer producing milk and therefore useless to him. Isaac turned to them immediately. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I couldn't help but overhear. You have a cow you're looking to get rid of?" The man, a grizzled rancher with tobacco-stained teeth, nodded. "That's right. She's about 6 years old. Went dry about a month ago. I was planning to butcher her for meat, but if someone wants to buy her off me, I'd consider it." "Would you take her to a vet first?" Isaac asked. See if there's any chance of getting her producing again? The rancher shrugged. I suppose so, if someone's willing to pay for it. But I'm telling you, she's done. Once they go dry like that, they rarely come back. But Isaac had an idea. He had noticed something while burying Julia's cow, something about the timing and the season. Cows could be bred year-round, and with the right care, even a dry cow could freshen again. It would take time, but it was possible. He spent the next hour negotiating with the rancher, finally settling on a price that would take almost all the money he had earned from his pelts, plus a promise of 2 more beaver pelts to be delivered by the end of summer. It was steep, but Isaac found himself not caring about the cost. He just wanted to see Julia's face when he brought her that cow. The next challenge was getting the rancher to agree to keep the cow for a few more days, while Isaac made some additional arrangements. He rode out to a small farm on the outskirts of town, where a veterinarian named Doc Morgan had a practice treating livestock. Isaac explained the situation, and after some consideration, Doc Morgan agreed to examine the cow and, if possible, recommend a breeding bull that might help get her producing again. 2 days later, Isaac stood in the rancher's yard watching as Doc Morgan examined the dry cow. The animal was docile, a pretty red and white Hereford with gentle eyes and a calm temperament. After a thorough examination, Doc Morgan delivered his verdict. She's in good health overall, he said, patting the cow's flank. I think she went dry because of stress. This fellow here, he nodded at the rancher, probably had too many animals competing for food and water. With better care and nutrition, and if we can get her bred, there's a good chance she'll freshen up again. I'd say about 4 to 5 months if we breed her now, then another month or so before she calves and starts producing milk. It wasn't ideal, Isaac knew. Julia needed milk and income now, not 6 months from now. But it was better than nothing, and it was the best he could do with the resources he had. He made one more stop before leaving town, using the last of his money to buy a 50-pound sack of good feed grain and some mineral supplements that Doc Morgan recommended. By the time Isaac started the long journey back to Julia's homestead, leading the cow behind his horse with the feed sack strapped to his pack horse, it was late afternoon on the 6th day since he had left her. He had told her it might take a few days, but he wondered if she had given up hope that he would return at all. The sun was setting as he finally approached her property, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. He saw Julia immediately, standing in her garden with a hoe in her hands. She had her back to him, working the soil around what looked like young potato plants. She must have heard his horse because she turned around, shading her eyes against the low sun. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. Then she dropped the hoe and started running toward him, her skirts flying. Isaac dismounted, and before he could say a word, she had thrown her arms around him in a fierce hug that nearly knocked him off balance despite his size. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "You actually came back." Isaac stood very still, acutely aware of her warmth pressed against him, of how perfectly she seemed to fit in his arms. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands and rested them on her back. "I told you I would." She pulled back suddenly, as if realizing what she had done, her cheeks flushing pink. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." "I keep my promises," Isaac said. He gestured to the cow, who was placidly grazing on the grass beside the road. "She's not perfect. She's dry right now, so no milk yet. But Doc Morgan examined her and thinks we can get her producing again if we breed her and take good care of her. I brought some feed and supplements to help." Julia's eyes had filled with tears again, but this time they were different. These were tears of relief, of hope. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. I can't believe you did this for me." "There's something else you should know," Isaac said. "She'll need to be bred soon if we want to get her freshened up. Doc Morgan said there's a farmer about 2 miles west of here who has a good breeding bull. He'll charge a small fee, but it's reasonable." "I don't have money for that," Julia said, her brief moment of joy dimming. "I'll cover it," Isaac said. "Consider it part of the deal." She shook her head firmly. "No, you've already done too much. I'll find a way to pay for it myself." "Julia," Isaac said, and she looked up at him. "Let me do this, please. You can pay me back later if it makes you feel better, but right now, let's just focus on getting this cow bred and healthy." She bit her lip, clearly struggling with her pride. Finally, she nodded. "All right, But I will pay you back, Mr. Walker. Every penny. Isaac, he corrected, if you're going to be calling me by my first name in your head anyway, you might as well say it out loud. A small smile tugged at her lips. Isaac, then. They stood there in the fading light, looking at each other, and Isaac felt something shift in the air between them. It was attraction, yes, but it was more than that. It was recognition, as if some part of him had been waiting all these years in the mountains for this moment, for this woman. Julia cleared her throat and stepped back. Will you stay for supper? It's the least I can do. I made stew, and there's plenty. Isaac knew he should decline. He should set up the cow in her barn, make sure she had water and grain, and then head back to his camp in the mountains. That would be the sensible thing to do. But instead, he heard himself saying, I'd like that. Thank you. Her smile widened, transforming her face from pretty to beautiful. Good. Let me help you get her settled first. They worked together to lead the cow into the small barn behind Julia's cabin. It was clean and well organized, with fresh straw on the floor and a water trough that Julia had recently filled. Isaac showed her how much grain to feed the cow and explained the supplements Doc Morgan had recommended. She's gentle, Julia said, stroking the cow's neck. What's her name? The rancher called her Rosie, but you can name her whatever you like. Julia considered this. I think Rosie is perfect. She looked at the cow thoughtfully. Thank you for not giving up, girl. We're going to take good care of you. Inside the cabin, Isaac was struck by how neat and orderly everything was. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a well-swept floor and handmade curtains at the windows. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a cook stove that looked well-maintained, and shelves lined with carefully organized supplies. A door on the far wall presumably led to a bedroom. Julia lavished out 2 bowls of stew from the pot on the stove and set them on the table, along with thick slices of bread. Isaac couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a home-cooked meal at a real table, and he found himself savoring every bite. This is delicious, he said, and meant it. The stew was simple, just potatoes, onions, and what tasted like rabbit, but it was seasoned perfectly and clearly made with care. Thank you, I trapped the rabbit myself yesterday, she said it matter-of-factly, but Isaac was impressed. Trapping was a skill that took time to learn, and the fact that she had mastered it spoke to her determination to survive. Your father taught you? He asked. She nodded. He taught me a lot of things, how to trap, how to shoot, how to read the weather and know when a storm was coming. He wanted me to be able to take care of myself. Her voice grew sad. I just wish he had taught me how to handle a difficult birth. Maybe I could have saved Bessie. Even experienced ranchers lose cows during calving, Isaac said gently. Sometimes there's nothing anyone can do. You shouldn't blame yourself. I know that in my head, Julia said, but my heart is having a harder time accepting it. They fell into a comfortable silence as they ate. Isaac found himself studying her in the lamplight, noticing details he had missed before. The way her hair caught the light, turning it to honey and gold. The delicate line of her jaw, the graceful movement of her hands. She had calluses on her palms, he noticed, the marks of hard work. But there was also a softness to her, a femininity that hadn't been beaten down by the harsh realities of frontier life. Tell me about yourself, Julia said suddenly. You said you've been in the mountains for 8 years. Where did you come from before that? Isaac set down his spoon, considering how much to tell her. He wasn't used to talking about himself, but something about Julia made him want to open up. I grew up in Denver, back when it was still a rough frontier town. My father was a blacksmith, good at his trade. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I never took to it. I liked the open spaces, the wilderness. When I was 21, I left home and headed into the mountains. Been there ever since. Do you ever get lonely? She asked softly. Sometimes, Isaac admitted, but I got used to my own company. And the mountains have their own kind of peace. There's something about being up there, above all the noise and complications of civilization, that feels right to me. He paused. At least, it used to. What changed? Isaac met her eyes across the table. I met a young woman who needed help, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than just surviving another winter. Julia's cheeks flushed pink again, but she held his gaze. I'm glad you came along when you did, Isaac. I don't know what I would have done without your help. You would have figured something out, Isaac said with certainty. You're a survivor, Julia. That's clear as day. They talked long into the evening, sharing stories and learning about each other. Julia told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about her mother's death from a fever when she was 17, about her father's decision to seek a new start in Colorado. Isaac shared stories of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and mountain lions, of harsh winters and beautiful summers, of the profound silence that could be found at high elevations. It was fully dark when Isaac finally stood to leave. Julia walked him out to where his horses were tied, and they stood together under a sky full of stars that seemed close enough to touch. "Will you come back?" Julia asked. "To check on Rosie, I mean. Make sure we're doing everything right." Isaac smiled. "I'll come back. In fact, how about I take you over to that farmer with the breeding bull in a couple of days? Make sure everything goes smoothly." "I'd like that," Julia said. Then, more quietly, "I'd really like that." Isaac mounted his horse, looking down at her standing in the starlight. 2 days then. I'll be here mid-morning." "I'll be waiting." As Isaac rode away toward his mountain camp, he found himself already counting the hours until he could see her again. The solitary life that had satisfied him for so many years suddenly seemed empty, and he knew with absolute certainty that Julia Preston had changed something fundamental in him. The only question was whether she felt the same way, and whether two people as independent and stubborn as they were could find a way to build a life together. 2 days later, Isaac returned to Julia's homestead just as the morning mist was burning off the valley. She was waiting for him, dressed in a practical split skirt for riding and a crisp white blouse. Her hair was braided and pinned up neatly, and she had a determined look on her face that Isaac was beginning to recognize meant she was nervous but refusing to show it. "Good morning," she called out, smiling when she saw him. "Morning," Isaac replied, dismounting. "Ready to take Rosie for a walk?" It took them the better part of an hour to lead the cow the 2 miles to the neighboring farm. Rosie was cooperative, but she was also curious, stopping frequently to investigate interesting patches of grass or to sniff the air. Julia walked beside the cow, talking to her in a soft, encouraging voice that Isaac found himself wanting to hear directed at him. The farmer, a middle-aged man named Thomas Brennan, was expecting them. Isaac had stopped by the previous day to make arrangements. Thomas led them to a large pen where his prize breeding bull, a massive Hereford with a gentle disposition, was kept. "He's a good bull," Thomas explained. "Strong bloodlines, produces healthy calves. Your cow should take to him just fine." Isaac paid the breeding fee while Thomas and Julia got Rosie settled in the pen with the bull. The process would take a few hours, Thomas explained, so they were welcome to wait at his house or come back later. "We'll wait," Isaac said, and Julia nodded in agreement. They spent the time walking around Thomas's property, which was considerably larger and more established than Julia's homestead. Julia asked questions about the crops Thomas grew, about his chickens and his other cattle, absorbing information like a sponge. Isaac could see her mind working, cataloging ideas for her own land. "Do you think I could do something like this?" she asked Isaac as they looked out over Thomas's flourishing vegetable garden. "Build something bigger, more sustainable?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Isaac said honestly. "You've already survived things that would have broken most people. Growing a bigger homestead should be easy in comparison." She laughed at that, a real laugh that lit up her whole face. "You have a funny definition of easy, Isaac Walker." When Rosie was ready to go home, they made the journey back at a leisurely pace. The day had turned warm and beautiful, with wildflowers blooming along the roadside and birds singing in the trees. Julia picked a handful of columbines, Colorado's state flower, and tucked one behind her ear. Isaac thought she had never looked more beautiful. Back at her homestead, Isaac helped Julia settle Rosie in the barn with fresh water and grain. As they worked side by side, their hands brushed accidentally, and Isaac felt a jolt of electricity run through him. Julia felt it too. He could tell from the way she caught her breath and looked up at him with wide eyes. "Isaac," she said softly. But whatever she had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. They both went outside to find 3 men riding up to the cabin. Isaac immediately tensed, moving slightly in front of Julia in an instinctive protective gesture. The men looked rough, with the lean, hungry look of prospectors who hadn't had much luck. The one in the lead, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, grinned when he saw Julia. "Well now," he said, dismounting, "aren't you a pretty little thing? Didn't realize anyone was living out here." "This is private property," Julia said firmly, though Isaac could hear the tremor in her voice. "I'll have to ask you to leave." The scarred man ignored her, looking around the property with an appraising eye. "Nice little setup you got here. Could use some company, though. A woman alone out here, that's not safe. Could be all sorts of dangers." "The lady isn't alone," Isaac said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And I suggest you three get back on your horses and ride on." The scarred man finally seemed to notice Isaac's size and the dangerous look in his eyes. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant, friend. We're just passing through looking for a place to camp for the night. Thought maybe the lady here might be willing to sell us some supplies." "I'm not," Julia said. "Now please leave." The other two men had dismounted as well, and they were spreading out in a way that Isaac didn't like at all. He recognized their body language, the way predators moved when they were preparing to attack. His hand moved to the knife at his belt, and he shifted his weight, preparing for trouble. "I said leave," Isaac repeated, his voice deadly calm. "This is your last warning." Something in his tone must have convinced them, because the scarred man made a gesture to his companions, and they all remounted. We're going. Just thought we'd be friendly, that's all." He looked at Julia one more time. "You be careful out here, miss. Never know what might happen to a woman on her own." They rode off, but Isaac watched them until they disappeared from sight. Even then, he kept his eyes on the direction they had gone, every instinct screaming that this wasn't over. "Thank you," Julia said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't like the way they looked at me." "Neither did I." Isaac turned to her, making a decision. "Julia, I don't think it's safe for you to be out here alone right now. Those men might come back when they think you're unprotected." "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting I camp out here for a few days, just until I'm sure they've moved on and aren't coming back." Julia bit her lip. "Isaac, I can't ask you to do that. You have your own life, your own work to do." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He held her gaze. "Please, Julia, I won't be able to sleep knowing you're out here alone with men like that around." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But I insist you sleep in the cabin. I have a spare cot, and it's going to rain tonight anyway. I can feel it in the air." Isaac wanted to argue that he should keep watch outside, but he could see the determination in her eyes. "All right," he agreed. "Thank you." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Isaac rode out to check the perimeter of Julia's property, looking for signs that the three men had circled back, but he found nothing. Julia, meanwhile, prepared another pot of stew and set up the spare cot in the main room of the cabin. It was narrow and short, barely adequate for a man of Isaac's size, but he had slept in worse places. That evening, as they ate dinner together for the second time, the atmosphere was different. There was an awareness between them now, an acknowledgement of the attraction that had been building since the moment they met. Julia seemed nervous, fidgeting with her spoon and avoiding his eyes. Isaac found himself memorizing details about her, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the small dimple that appeared in her cheek when she smiled. "Isaac," she said finally, setting down her spoon, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "In 8 years in the mountains, was there ever anyone special? A woman, I mean?" Isaac considered the question carefully. "There was someone, a long time ago. Before I went into the mountains, her name was Sarah, and we were engaged to be married. But she wanted a different life than the one I could give her. She wanted city society, parties, and nice dresses, a husband who worked a respectable job and came home every evening. I wanted freedom, adventure, the wilderness. In the end, we both realized we wanted different things, and she married a banker's son." "Do you regret it?" Julia asked softly. "Not anymore," Isaac said, and he realized it was true. "For a long time I thought I did, but I think I was more in love with the idea of her than with who she actually was. We wouldn't have made each other happy." He paused. "What about you? Was there anyone back in Pennsylvania?" Julia shook her head. "There was a boy who courted me when I was 18, but my father didn't approve of him. Said he was lazy and would never amount to anything. I was angry at the time, but father was right. Last I heard, the boy was still living with his parents and drinking away whatever money he earned." She looked at Isaac directly. I never felt about him the way I—" She stopped, blushing. "The way you what?" Isaac prompted gently. She took a deep breath. "The way I'm starting to feel about you." The words hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable. Isaac felt his heart hammering in his chest. He stood up from the table and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his much larger ones. "Julia," he said, "I came back here with that cow because it was the right thing to do. But I've stayed, and I keep coming back because of you. Because from the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you, like we were meant to find each other out here in this wild country." Her eyes glistened with tears. "I thought I was the only one feeling this. I thought maybe I was being foolish, falling for the first man who showed me kindness." "It's not foolishness," Isaac assured her, "and it's not just kindness. Julia, I've been alone for 8 years by choice. I liked my solitary life. But these past few days with you have shown me what I've been missing. You make me want things I haven't wanted in a very long time." "What things?" she whispered. "A home, a partner, someone to build a life with." He reached up and gently touched her cheek. "Someone to love." Julia leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I want those things too. I've been so scared since Father died, trying to convince myself that I could make it alone. But the truth is, I don't want to be alone. I want someone to share this life with, the hard parts and the beautiful parts." Isaac stood and gently pulled her to her feet, drawing her close. "I'm not an easy man to love," he warned. "I'm rough around the edges, used to my own ways. I'll probably drive you crazy sometimes." She laughed softly. "And I'm stubborn and independent, and I'll definitely drive you crazy. But maybe we can drive each other crazy together." "I'd like that," Isaac said. Then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of each other. But then Julia's arms came up around his neck, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more passionate, more urgent. Isaac pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back. She fit against him perfectly, her softness complementing his hardness, and Isaac felt like he had finally come home after years of wandering. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julia rested her forehead against his chest. "That was—" she trailed off. "Yeah," Isaac agreed, his voice rough. "It was." They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the roof just as Julia had predicted. Isaac felt a contentment settle over him that he had never experienced before, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with the mountains or the wilderness and everything to do with the woman in his arms. That night, they lay in their separate beds on opposite sides of the cabin, listening to the rain and talking quietly in the darkness. They shared more stories, more pieces of themselves, building the foundation of something that both of them hoped would last. Over the next few days, Isaac remained at Julia's homestead, helping with the endless work that came with maintaining a small farm. He repaired her chicken coop, which had been damaged in a recent windstorm. He taught her how to make better snares for catching rabbits and other small game. He showed her some tricks for getting better yields from her garden. And all the while, they grew closer, their relationship deepening from attraction into something that looked a lot like love. The 3 rough-looking men never came back, and Isaac began to think that maybe they had just been passing through after all. Still, he was glad he had stayed. Being with Julia felt natural, as if they had known each other for years instead of days. On the 5th evening after he'd first stayed over, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and orange, Julia turned to him with a serious expression. "Isaac, I need to ask you something important." "Anything," he said. "You've been helping me so much, spending all this time here. But you have your own life, your own camp in the mountains. I don't want you to feel obligated to stay here forever just because we're—" She struggled to find the right words. "Because we're falling in love," Isaac supplied. She nodded, blushing. "Yes, that. I don't want you to resent me someday for tying you down, for taking away your freedom." Isaac took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Julia, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I haven't felt obligated to do anything. Everything I've done, Every moment I've spent here has been because I wanted to. Because being with you makes me happier than I've been in years, maybe ever. As for my freedom, well, I've learned something important this past week. Freedom isn't about being alone in the mountains. Real freedom is being with someone you choose, someone who chooses you back. But what about your trapping, your way of life? I can't ask you to give that up. You're not asking, Isaac pointed out, and I'm not giving it up entirely. I still need to check my trap lines, bring in pelts to sell. But maybe I don't need to live up there alone anymore. Maybe I could have a base here with you, and make trips up to the mountains when I need to. Julia's eyes widened. Are you saying you want to live here, with me? If you'll have me. Isaac's heart was pounding. This was moving fast, he knew that. But out here in the wild country, people didn't have the luxury of long courtships and slow decisions. You had to trust your instincts. And his instincts were telling him that Julia Preston was the woman he had been waiting for all his life. Yes, Julia breathed. Yes, I'll have you. But Isaac, we barely know each other. Shouldn't we take more time, be sure this is real? How much time do you need? Isaac asked. I already know everything important about you. I know you're strong and brave and kind. I know you're not afraid of hard work. I know you face your fears head on instead of running from them. I know that when you smile, it makes me want to spend the rest of my life finding ways to make you smile again. What else do I need to know? Tears were running down Julia's cheeks now, but she was smiling. When you put it like that, it sounds so simple. Maybe it is simple, Isaac said. We're two people who found each other against all odds in this big, wild territory. We both know what it's like to be alone, to struggle, to survive. And we both know that surviving isn't the same as living. I want to really live, Julia. With you. She threw her arms around him, and he held her tight, feeling like the luckiest man alive. They stayed like that as the sun sank below the mountains and the stars began to appear, making silent promises to each other and to the future they would build together. The next morning, Isaac rode into Breckenridge to take care of some business. He needed to get supplies, sell some items from his mountain camp that he wouldn't need anymore, and most importantly, he wanted to speak to the preacher about performing a wedding ceremony. The preacher, a kindly man named Reverend Mitchell, listened to Isaac's request with a smile. I'd be happy to marry you and Miss Preston, he said. But son, are you sure about this? You've only known her a week or so. I'm sure, Isaac said firmly. More sure than I've ever been about anything. Reverend Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I can see that. All right then. When would you like to have the ceremony? As soon as possible. This Sunday, if you can manage it. Sunday it is. Will you be having witnesses? Isaac hadn't thought about that. I suppose we'll need some. Can you help with that? Of course. My wife and I would be happy to stand as witnesses. Why don't you bring Miss Preston into town on Saturday? That way you can both stay at the boarding house, and we'll have the ceremony Sunday morning at the church. Gives her a chance to meet some of the townspeople, too. A woman alone out there should have friends and neighbors she can call on. It was good advice, and Isaac agreed. He spent the rest of the day making arrangements, buying supplies, and spreading the word that he was getting married. The news caused quite a stir in the small town. Isaac Walker, the solitary mountain man who rarely came to town and spoke even less, was settling down with a homesteader's daughter. People were curious, and more than a few women made a point of asking him about his bride-to-be. When Isaac returned to Julia's homestead that evening, loaded down with supplies and bursting with news, he found her in the garden pulling weeds. She stood up when she saw him, shading her eyes against the setting sun. You were gone a long time, she called out. I was starting to worry. Isaac dismounted and strode over to her, pulling her into his arms and kissing her soundly. When he released her, she was breathless and laughing. What was that for? She asked. Do I need a reason to kiss the woman I love? Isaac countered. But actually, I do have a reason. Julia Preston, I have a question to ask you, and I should have done this properly last night, but I was too caught up in the moment. He dropped to one knee in the dirt of her garden, taking her hand in his. Julia's eyes went wide, and her free hand flew to her mouth. Julia, I know we've only known each other a short time, but I also know that you're the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. You're brave and beautiful and stronger than you know. You make me want to be a better man, to build something lasting instead of just drifting through life. Will you marry me? Yes, Julia said immediately, pulling him to his feet. Yes, yes, yes. She was crying and laughing at the same time, and Isaac felt his own eyes getting wet. I spoke to the preacher in town, he said. He can marry us this Sunday if you're willing. I know it's fast, but out here there's no point in waiting. We know what we want. Sunday, Julia repeated, looking dazed. That's only 4 days away. Is it too soon? Isaac asked, suddenly worried. We can wait longer if you want. But Julia shook her head firmly. No, it's not too soon. Sunday is perfect. I don't need time to be sure about this, about you. I've never been more sure of anything. They spent the evening making plans, talking excitedly about their future. Isaac told her about Reverend Mitchell's suggestion that they come to town on Saturday and stay at the boarding house, and Julia agreed it was a good idea. She would need to find something appropriate to wear for the ceremony, and she was nervous about meeting the townspeople who would become her neighbors. They'll love you, Isaac assured her. How could they not? The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Isaac spent his time making improvements to the cabin, determined that it would be a proper home for his bride. He enlarged the main room, added shelves and storage, and built a new bed frame for what would become their shared bedroom. Julia, meanwhile, focused on preparing for their move to a shared life. She cleaned every corner of the cabin, made new curtains, and tried to figure out what she would wear for her wedding. On Friday evening, she confessed her worry to Isaac. I don't have anything nice enough for a wedding. Everything I own is practical work clothes. You'd be beautiful in a flour sack, Isaac said, making her laugh. But I actually thought of that. There's a dressmaker in town, Mrs. Henderson. I spoke to her, and she said if you come in early Saturday morning, she can alter one of her ready-made dresses to fit you. My treat? Julia's eyes filled with tears. Isaac Walker, you are the kindest, most thoughtful man I've ever met. I'm just trying to take care of you, Isaac said, the way you deserve to be taken care of. They set out for Breckenridge early Saturday morning, with Julia riding Isaac's pack horse while he led the way on his larger mount. Julia had left Rosie with plenty of food and water and had asked Thomas Brennan to check on her animals while they were gone. The 2-hour ride to town gave them more time to talk and dream about their future. I want to expand the homestead, Julia said. Maybe get more cattle, some sheep, plant fruit trees. I was thinking if we work hard, in a few years we could have a real ranch. We'll do it, Isaac promised. Whatever you want to build, we'll build it together. Breckenridge was bustling when they arrived, full of Saturday activity. Isaac took Julia straight to Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, where the kind older woman immediately took Julia under her wing. Isaac left them to their work and went to check on the arrangements for Sunday, making sure everything was in order. When he returned to the dress shop an hour later, Julia emerged from the back room looking like an angel. Mrs. Henderson had found a beautiful ivory dress with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It fit Julia perfectly, highlighting her figure while remaining modest and appropriate for a church wedding. Her hair was pinned up in a style more elegant than Isaac had seen before, with a few curls framing her face. You're stunning, Isaac said, his voice rough with emotion. Julia blushed prettily. You're sure it's not too much? It's perfect. You're perfect. They spent the rest of the day walking around town, with Isaac introducing Julia to the people who would be her neighbors. To his relief, everyone was friendly and welcoming. The women especially seemed pleased to have another woman in the area, and several invited Julia to join their church social group. Julia blossomed under the attention, her natural warmth and friendliness winning people over. That evening, they had dinner at the boarding house where they were staying. Isaac had paid for 2 rooms, wanting to be proper, though it was hard to say goodnight to Julia and watch her disappear behind her door. He lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about the next day and what it would mean. He was about to commit his life to Julia's, to take on the responsibility of being her husband and protector. It should have scared him, but instead, he felt only anticipation and joy. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Colorado summer day. Isaac dressed in the new clothes he had bought for the occasion, a white shirt and dark trousers with a vest. He felt strange and uncomfortable in the formal attire, but it was worth it for this day. At the church, Reverend Mitchell greeted him with a warm handshake. Ready, son? More than ready, Isaac said. The church was surprisingly full. Word had spread about the wedding, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to witness it. Isaac stood at the front of the church, his palms sweating, until he heard the door open at the back. Julia walked down the aisle on the arm of Thomas Brennan, who had volunteered to give her away since her father couldn't. She looked radiant, her face glowing with happiness as she made her way toward Isaac. When she reached him and took his hand, Isaac felt like his heart might burst. The ceremony itself was a blur. Isaac repeated the vows after Reverend Mitchell, promising to love and cherish Julia, to stand by her in good times and bad, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as they both lived. Julia made the same promises, her voice steady and clear, her eyes never leaving his face. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, and told Isaac he could kiss his bride, Isaac didn't hold back. He pulled Julia into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, earning applause and a few whistles from the congregation. Julia laughed against his mouth, and Isaac felt happiness wash over him in waves. After the ceremony, several of the church women had organized a small reception in the church hall. There was cake and coffee, and people lined up to congratulate the newlyweds. Julia was radiant, charming everyone she met, and Isaac stood beside her feeling proud and protective and deeply, utterly in love. As the afternoon wore on and they prepared to leave, Mrs. Mitchell pulled Julia aside for a quiet word. Isaac watched as the older woman spoke earnestly to his bride, and saw Julia nod and squeeze her hand in thanks. He wondered what had been said, but didn't have a chance to ask before they were mounting their horses for the ride home. It was late afternoon by the time they reached the homestead. Isaac helped Julia down from her horse, but instead of releasing her, he swept her up in his arms, making her shriek with laughter. "Isaac, what are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said, striding toward the cabin door. "It's tradition." "You're going to hurt your back," she protested, but she was smiling. "You weigh nothing," Isaac said, which was an exaggeration, but not much of one. He carried her easily into the cabin and set her down gently, closing the door behind them. For a moment they just stood there, looking at each other in the fading afternoon light. Then Julia reached up and began unpinning her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. "I've been wanting to do this all day," she said softly. "Take down my hair, take off this dress, and finally be alone with my husband." Isaac crossed the space between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "I've been waiting for this moment since the day I met you," he confessed. "I want to spend the rest of the night showing you exactly how much I love you." "Then what are you waiting for?" Julia whispered. Isaac kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and passion and promise into that kiss. Julia responded with equal fervor, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair. They stumbled toward the bedroom, helping each other out of their formal clothing with fumbling, eager hands. And as the sun set over the mountains and darkness fell over the valley, Isaac and Julia consummated their marriage, giving themselves to each other completely and without reservation. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness. Isaac and Julia fell into a comfortable routine, working side by side during the day and falling into each other's arms at night. They were both learning how to be part of a partnership, how to compromise and communicate and support each other. It wasn't always easy. They were both used to making their own decisions and doing things their own way, but they made it work because they were both committed to building a life together. Rosie the cow was doing well on her new diet and supplements, and Julia checked on her multiple times a day, talking to her and making sure she was comfortable. The chickens were laying well, providing eggs that Julia sold in town, along with vegetables from her thriving garden. Isaac made trips up to his mountain traplines every few days, checking his snares and bringing back pelts and game. The money from selling furs and produce was modest, but it was enough to get by, and they were both happy. One morning, about a month after their wedding, Isaac woke to find Julia kneeling in the corner of the bedroom, being violently sick into a basin. He was at her side immediately, holding her hair back and rubbing her back as she retched. "I'm sorry," she gasped when the wave of nausea passed. "I don't know what's wrong with me. This is the 3rd morning in a row." Isaac felt his heart skip a beat. "Julia, when was your last monthly time?" She looked up at him, confusion in her eyes, and then understanding dawned. Her hand flew to her stomach, her eyes going wide. I'm late. I didn't even think about it with everything that's been happening. Isaac, do you think?" "I think we might be having a baby," Isaac said, joy flooding through him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully. "Are you all right? How do you feel about this?" Julia pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm happy," she said. "Scared, but happy. Are you happy?" "Julia, I'm over the moon," Isaac said honestly. "A baby. Our baby. I can't think of anything more wonderful." They held each other, both crying and laughing, overwhelmed by this unexpected blessing. Later that morning, after Julia's stomach had settled, they rode into town to see Doc Morgan. The veterinarian also served as the town's doctor when needed, and he confirmed what they suspected. Julia was indeed pregnant, probably about 6 weeks along if he had to guess. "You're young and healthy," Doc Morgan told Julia. "You should have no problems with the pregnancy. Just make sure you're eating well, getting enough rest, and don't do any heavy lifting. The baby should arrive sometime in late March or early April next year." On the ride home, Julia was quiet, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Isaac kept glancing over at her, worried about what she might be thinking. "Are you all right?" he finally asked. "I'm thinking about my mother," Julia admitted, wishing she could be here for this. She would have been so excited to be a grandmother. "I'm sure she's watching over you from wherever she is," Isaac said, "and she'd be proud of you, Julia, so proud of the strong woman you've become." Julia smiled at him, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you. And Isaac, I'm glad it's you. I'm glad our baby will have you as a father. You're going to be wonderful." "I'm going to try," Isaac promised. "That's all I can do." As summer turned to fall and Julia's belly began to swell with their growing child, Isaac threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from smooth pine wood, carving delicate designs into the headboard. He reinforced the cabin's walls and roof, making sure it would withstand the harsh mountain winter. He laid in extra supplies, determined that Julia and the baby would want for nothing. Julia, meanwhile, sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her face serene as she worked. She was glowing with health despite the occasional bout of nausea, and Isaac thought she had never been more beautiful. Her body was changing, becoming softer and rounder, and he loved every new curve and swell. By October, Rosie was showing definite signs of being pregnant as well, her belly rounding out just like Julia's. It seemed fitting somehow that they would both be welcoming new life come spring. The breeding had taken, just as Doc Morgan had predicted, and with proper care, Rosie would freshen after she calved and start producing milk again. That winter was the happiest of Isaac's life. Even though the days were short and the nights long and cold, being snowed in with Julia felt like paradise. They spent their evenings by the fire, talking and dreaming about their future, about the child who would soon join them. Isaac read to Julia from the books she loved, everything from Shakespeare to practical guides on animal husbandry. Julia taught Isaac how to knit, and though his large hands were clumsy with the needles at first, he eventually managed to make a passable baby blanket. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply but joyfully. Isaac had gone into town a few days before, braving the snow-packed roads to buy Julia a gift. It was a beautiful shawl made of soft wool, dyed a deep blue that matched her eyes. Julia had made him a new shirt, hand-stitched with careful precision, and a pair of warm gloves lined with rabbit fur. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Julia said as they sat together by the fire that night. Her belly was large now, the baby moving actively inside her. "Last Christmas, Father had just died, and I thought I'd never be happy again. Now look at us. We have a home, a life, a baby on the way. It's like a miracle." "You're my miracle," Isaac said, kissing her gently. "You and this baby both." As winter slowly gave way to spring, they both grew increasingly excited and anxious about the approaching birth. Julia had made friends with several women in town, and they had shared advice and stories about childbirth, some reassuring and some terrifying. Isaac tried not to show his fear, but the truth was he was terrified something would go wrong. He had already lost so much in his life, the thought of losing Julia or the baby was unbearable. In late March, with the snow still deep but the days growing longer, Rosie went into labor. This time, unlike with poor Bessie, everything went smoothly. Isaac and Julia worked together, helping the cow through the birthing process, and by evening they were admiring a beautiful red and white heifer calf. "She's perfect," Julia said, leaning against Isaac's shoulder. Her own belly was enormous now, and she was uncomfortable most of the time, but she was smiling as she watched the calf nurse from its mother. "Look, Rosie is producing milk already. That means we'll have milk and butter and cheese again soon, Isaac said. And if we sell this calf in the fall, we'll have money to expand the herd like you wanted. It's all coming together, Julia said wonderingly. Everything we planned, it's actually happening. 2 weeks later, on a warm April morning with wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows, Julia woke Isaac before dawn with a hand on his shoulder. "Isaac," she said quietly, "it's time. The baby is coming." Isaac was out of bed instantly, his heart racing. They had planned for this, had everything ready, but now that the moment was actually here, he felt panic rising in his chest. He forced it down, knowing Julia needed him to be strong. "All right," he said, trying to sound calm. "Let me get the supplies ready, and then I'll ride for town and get Doc Morgan." "No," Julia said, gripping his hand. "There's no time. The pains are already close together. This baby is coming fast." Isaac felt the panic surge again, but he pushed it down and focused. He had helped deliver calves and foals, had even assisted when one of his neighbor's dogs had a difficult birth years ago. A human birth couldn't be that different, could it? Over the next several hours, Isaac did his best to help Julia through her labor. She was incredibly brave, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. Her face bathed in sweat as the contractions came harder and faster. Isaac held her hand, wiped her face, offered her water, and felt completely helpless in the face of her pain. "I can't do this," Julia gasped at one point, tears streaming down her face. "Isaac, I can't." "Yes, you can," Isaac said firmly, kneeling beside the bed and taking both her hands in his. "You're the strongest person I know, Julia. You survived your father's death, survived alone in this wilderness, survived everything life has thrown at you. You can do this. I believe in you." She nodded, gathering herself for another push. And finally, as the sun reached its zenith and light streamed through the cabin windows, their baby entered the world with a lusty cry. Isaac caught the infant with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the tiny, perfect miracle he was holding. "It's a boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Julia, we have a son." He cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped him in the soft blankets Julia had made, then placed him in his mother's arms. Julia was crying and laughing at the same time, staring down at their son with wonder. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "Isaac, look at him. He has your eyes." The baby did indeed have Isaac's dark eyes and a surprising amount of black hair. His face was red and scrunched up, and he was still crying. But to Isaac, he was the most perfect thing he had ever seen. "What should we name him?" Isaac asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arm around his wife and son. "I want to name him after my father," Julia said. James Walker." "James," Isaac repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world, son." The next few weeks were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Baby James was healthy and strong, with a powerful set of lungs that he used frequently, especially at night. Julia recovered quickly from the birth, though she was tired from the round-the-clock demands of caring for a newborn. Isaac did everything he could to help, taking over all the household chores and outdoor work so Julia could focus on the baby. He had never imagined he could love anything as much as he loved his little family. Watching Julia nurse their son, seeing the tender way she cradled him and sang to him, made Isaac's chest ache with love. And holding James, feeling the weight of that tiny body in his arms, knowing that this little person was depending on him for everything, filled Isaac with a fierce protectiveness unlike anything he had ever experienced. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, they settled into their new life as parents. James grew quickly, becoming more alert and interactive. His first smile, directed at Julia as she bent over his cradle, made both parents cry with joy. His first laugh, startled out of him when Isaac blew raspberries on his belly, was a sound Isaac knew he would remember for the rest of his life. The homestead prospered that year. With Rosie producing milk again, Julia was able to make butter and cheese to sell in town. The garden flourished under her care, yielding abundant vegetables. Isaac's trapping continued to be successful, and he was able to save money toward expanding their holdings. In the fall, they sold Rosie's heifer calf for a good price and used the money to buy lumber and supplies. Over the next few years, they gradually built the ranch Julia had dreamed of. They added on to the cabin, creating more living space and a separate room for James. They built a larger barn and bought more cattle, along with some sheep and even a pair of pigs. Isaac cleared more land for pasture and crops. Julia started taking in laundry from the miners who passed through, adding to their income. Their family grew as well. When James was 2 years old, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Jane, after Julia's mother. Jane had her mother's honey-colored hair and green eyes, and from the start, she was a calm, serene baby, the opposite of her energetic older brother. 2 years after Jane came another son, whom they named Joseph. Joseph was a happy, chubby baby who rarely cried and seemed content to simply observe the world around him with wide, curious eyes. Isaac sometimes stood on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, and marveled at how much his life had changed. 7 years ago, he had been a solitary mountain man, content with his own company and convinced he would live and die alone in the wilderness. Now he had a thriving ranch, a wife he loved more with each passing day, and 3 beautiful children who filled his house with noise and laughter and love. Julia would often join him on the porch once the children were asleep, slipping her hand into his and leaning against his shoulder. She had grown even more beautiful over the years, maturity and motherhood adding depth to her features. There were lines around her eyes now from smiling, and her hands were rougher from hard work, but to Isaac, she was as lovely as the day he first saw her crying over her dead cow. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked him one evening. "Your old life in the mountains?" Isaac considered the question, but he already knew the answer. "No," he said honestly. "I thought that life was enough for me, but I was wrong. I didn't know what I was missing until I found you. This life, with you and our children, this is everything I never knew I wanted." "I'm glad," Julia said softly, "because I can't imagine my life without you. That day you came along and found me crying. It felt like the end of everything. I had lost so much, and I thought I was going to lose everything else too. But you saved me, Isaac, not just by bringing me Rosie, but by giving me hope again, by showing me that I didn't have to face everything alone." "We saved each other," Isaac corrected gently. "I was alone by choice, but that doesn't mean I wasn't lonely. You showed me what it means to have a home, to have love, to have a purpose beyond just surviving." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. From inside the cabin came the faint sound of Jane crying, probably having a bad dream. Julia started to go inside, but Isaac stopped her. "I'll get her," he said. "You stay here and enjoy the quiet for a few more minutes." He went inside and scooped up his daughter, holding her against his broad chest and rocking her gently. Jane settled immediately, her little arms wrapping around his neck. Through the window, Isaac could see Julia still standing on the porch, her face turned toward the mountains that had brought them together. As he stood there in the dim cabin, holding his daughter while his sons slept peacefully in their room and his wife waited for him on the porch, Isaac felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. This was what life was supposed to be, he realized. Not just surviving, not just existing, but truly living. Having people to love and protect, having a purpose, having roots that went deep into the earth. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a sturdy boy who loved working with the animals and following his father around the ranch. Jane was gentle and nurturing, already showing signs of having her mother's skill with growing things. Joseph was the thinker of the family, always asking questions and wanting to understand how everything worked. When James was 10, Jane 8, and Joseph 6, Julia became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and Isaac worried constantly about her health. But Julia was as strong as ever, and when their time came, she delivered a healthy baby boy they named Jonathan. The ranch had grown into a successful operation by then, with a substantial herd of cattle and a reputation for quality livestock that stretched throughout the territory. Isaac had built a solid reputation as well, known as a fair dealer and a hard worker. Other ranchers and homesteaders in the area looked to him for advice and assistance, and he was always willing to help. The town of Breckenridge had grown too, evolving from a rough mining camp into a proper town with schools and churches and civic organizations. The Walker family was well known and respected there. Julia had become a leader in the community, helping to organize charity efforts and serving on the school board. One day, when Isaac was 42 years old and Julia 39, they stood together on a ridge overlooking their property. James, now 20, was down in the valley with his younger siblings, teaching them how to rope cattle. The sight of their 4 children working together, laughing and competing with each other, made both parents smile. "We've built something good here," Julia said, sliding her arm around Isaac's waist. "Something lasting." "We have," Isaac agreed. "And it all started with a cow." Julia laughed. "Poor Bessie. I still think about her sometimes, you know. If she hadn't died, if you hadn't found me crying that day, none of this would have happened." "I think we would have found each other somehow," Isaac said. "We were meant to be together, Julia. I've never doubted that for a single day." "Neither have I." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together watching their children, watching the sun paint golden light across the land they had worked so hard to build into a home. That evening, with all 4 children finally asleep and the house quiet, Isaac and Julia sat by the fire in the living room they had added to the cabin years ago. Julia was mending a shirt while Isaac worked on a new bridle for one of the horses. It was a peaceful domestic scene, the kind that Isaac had once thought would bore him, but instead brought him deep satisfaction. "Isaac," Julia said suddenly, setting down her mending, "I want to tell you something." He looked up, hearing the serious tone in her voice. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about how our story will be told someday, long after we're gone, when our grandchildren ask their children about us, about how we met and built this ranch." She smiled. "I hope they tell them the truth, that a mountain man found a woman crying because her cow had died, and he brought her a new one before the week ended. And in doing so, he brought her hope and love and a future she had thought was lost." Isaac set down the bridle and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his. Even after all these years, touching her still sent a thrill through him. "And I hope they tell them how that woman taught a lonely mountain man what it meant to have a home, to have a family, to have love. How she took a man who was just surviving and gave him a reason to truly live." "We were both so alone," Julia said softly. "And now we're surrounded by all this love. Sometimes I can hardly believe how blessed we are." "I believe it," Isaac said, pulling her close, "because I see it every day in your face, in our children's faces. I feel it every time I come home and you're here waiting for me. I live it every moment of every day." They sat together in the firelight, holding each other the way they had on so many nights over the years. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of another Colorado winter. But inside, the Walker home was warm and full of love. James eventually took over the ranch, running it with the same dedication and integrity his father had shown. He married a local girl named Emma, and they gave Isaac and Julia their first grandchildren. Jane married a school teacher and moved to Denver, though she visited often with her own growing family. Joseph became a veterinarian, studying under Doc Morgan and eventually taking over his practice. Jonathan, the baby of the family, showed an early aptitude for business and became the family's connection to the wider world of commerce, helping to market their livestock far beyond Colorado's borders. As Isaac and Julia grew older, they gradually handed over more responsibility to their children, content to spend their days enjoying the fruits of their decades of hard work. They took long walks around the property together, pointing out places where significant things had happened. The spot where Isaac had first kissed Julia, the ridge where they had watched the sunrise the morning after their wedding, the meadow where they had picnicked with baby James for the first time. On their 35th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party at the ranch. The house was full of love and laughter, 3 generations of Walkers celebrating the couple who had started it all. During the party, James stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us all what it means to work hard, to persevere through difficulties, and most importantly, to love without reservation." Their story began with an act of kindness, a mountain man helping a stranger in need. But it grew into something so much bigger. It grew into all of this. He gestured around the room, at his siblings and their families, at the prosperous ranch visible through the windows. Everything we have, everything we are, we owe to them, to their love and their determination and their faith in each other. Everyone raised their glasses, and Isaac and Julia, sitting side by side with their hands entwined, accepted the tribute with tears in their eyes. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Isaac and Julia lay in their bed, the same bed where all 4 of their children had been born. Julia's head rested on Isaac's chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her, the same way they had slept for 35 years. "It's been a good life," Julia said softly. "The best life," Isaac agreed. "I wouldn't change a single moment of it." "Not even the hard parts? The years when money was tight, when we didn't know if we'd make it through the winter?" "Especially not those parts," Isaac said firmly. "Those times showed us what we were made of. They made us stronger, made us appreciate what we have." Julia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember what you told me that first day? That you had been alone for a long time and had forgotten what it was like to be part of a community, to help neighbors and accept help in return?" "I remember," Isaac said. "You also said that maybe you needed it as much as I did. You were right. We both needed each other, needed this life. We saved each other that day, Isaac. You saved me from despair and loneliness, and I saved you from a life that looked like freedom, but was really just another kind of prison." Isaac tightened his arms around her, feeling the truth of her words deep in his bones. "We saved each other," he agreed, "and then we built something beautiful together." As they drifted off to sleep, Isaac thought about that day so long ago when he had been riding down from the mountains and had seen a young woman crying beside the road. He thought about how easily he could have ridden past, minding his own business as he had done for so many years. But something had made him stop, some instinct or fate or divine intervention that had known he was looking at his future, even if he hadn't realized it yet. The years continued to pass gently for Isaac and Julia. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, growing into one of the most successful operations in Colorado. Isaac and Julia's love story became a family legend, told and retold to each new generation. When Isaac was 65 and Julia 62, they took a trip together, riding up into the mountains where Isaac had once lived alone. He showed her his old trapping grounds, the places where he had spent long winters in solitude. Looking at those places now, remembering that version of himself, felt like looking at a stranger. "I can't imagine you here alone," Julia said as they stood beside the remains of his old camp. "You're such a family man, so meant to be surrounded by people who love you." "I didn't know what I was missing," Isaac said. "I thought I was content, but I was really just numb." "You woke me up, Julia. You showed me how to feel again, how to love, how to live." On the ride back down the mountain, Isaac took one last look at the peaks that had been his home for so long. He felt gratitude for those years, for the lessons they had taught him about survival and self-reliance, but he felt no regret about leaving that life behind. His real life had begun the day he found Julia Preston crying beside her dead cow, and he had never looked back. Isaac lived to be 78 years old, Julia 75. They died within 6 months of each other, Isaac passing peacefully in his sleep one winter night, Julia following him the next spring as the first wildflowers began to bloom. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, their graves marked with simple stone markers that bore their names and the dates of their lives. But their legacy lived on in their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The Walker Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations. And the story of how it all began, of the mountain man who found a woman crying and brought her a new cow before the week ended, that story lived on too. It was told at family gatherings, shared with new spouses joining the family, taught to children as an example of how one act of kindness can change everything. Because that's what Isaac's decision to help Julia had been, an act of kindness that had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined. It had grown into love, into family, into a legacy that would stretch far into the future. It had taken 2 lonely people and given them a reason to live, to hope, to love without fear or reservation. And perhaps that was the real moral of their story, that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we choose to stop and help someone in need, even when it would be easier to just ride on by. because you never know when that moment of kindness might lead to everything you never knew you were looking for. The last person to hear the full story from someone who had actually known Isaac and Julia was a great-great-granddaughter named Sarah Walker, who interviewed her elderly grandmother in the 1960s. The grandmother had been there at that 35th anniversary party, had been one of the grandchildren playing in the house while Isaac and Julia held court. She remembered them as a couple who always sat close together, who looked at each other with eyes full of love, even after decades of marriage, who seemed to communicate without words the way people do when they know each other completely. "What was the secret?" Sarah asked her grandmother. "How did they make it work for so long, through all the hard times?" The old woman smiled. "Your great-great-grandmother told me once that the secret was simple. They both woke up every day and chose each other, chose their family, chose the life they were building. Even on the hard days, especially on the hard days, they made that choice. And they never forgot how they started, with him reaching out to help her when she needed it most. They carried that forward, always helping each other, always being there when the other one needed support." Sarah thought about that for a long time after her grandmother died. She thought about it when she met her own husband, when she made the decision to marry him, when they faced their own challenges and hard times. And she tried to live by the example Isaac and Julia had set, choosing love every day, choosing to help when help was needed, choosing to build something lasting instead of just surviving. Because that was the true legacy of Isaac and Julia Walker, not just the successful ranch or the large family, but the example they set of what love could be when two people committed fully to each other and to the life they were building. They showed that happy endings were possible, even for people who started out alone and afraid. They proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest acts of human kindness. And it all started with a mountain man who saw a woman crying and decided to stop and help, who brought her a cow before the week ended, and in doing so, brought her so much more. He brought her love and hope and a future full of joy. And she gave him the same in return, transforming them both from lonely survivors into partners in a grand adventure called life. Their story became a testament to the power of compassion, to the importance of human connection, to the beautiful things that can happen when we open our hearts to love. It reminded their descendants, generation after generation, that we are not meant to face life alone, that there is strength in partnership, that love can conquer even the harshest circumstances. And so the story lived on, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling but always maintaining its essential truth. A mountain man found a woman crying because her cow had died, and he brought her a new one before the week ended. And in that simple act of kindness, two lives were forever changed, two lonely souls found their home in each other, and a love story for the ages began. The mountains still stand over that Colorado valley, eternal and unchanging. The ranch still operates, though it has changed hands many times over the years. But if you know where to look, you can still find the two simple graves on the hill, side by side, just as Isaac and Julia lived their lives. And if you visit on a quiet evening when the wind is just right, you might hear the echo of their love story in the rustling of the leaves, a reminder that the best things in life often come from the simplest choices, and that one moment of kindness can truly change everything.